This week we learned that Nintendo will be shutting down the Virtual Console and everything else connected to the 3DS and Wii U eShop in a little over a year. But what makes this feel 1,000 times worse is how Nintendo has been treating the barely existent Nintendo Switch online subscription service. I mean, this month we received both EarthBound on the Super Nintendo and EarthBound Beginnings on the NES, which just so happened to be the first new games on the standard Nintendo Switch online subscription service since July of last year. Expansion pack owners will not only get these games, but also The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask on February 25th. Today we're going to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Nintendo Power, Super Play, and more to see what critics thought about these classics when they were first released. Join me for an adventure game-filled episode of Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew. EarthBound is the perfect example of just how much opinions can change on a game in 27 years. These days, the 16-bit role-playing game is considered an all-time classic, rivaling genre greats like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. However, back when it first came out, the reception for EarthBound was a lot more mixed. Some outlets liked it, others were not that impressed, and some, like Electronic Gaming Monthly and Next Generation, completely dismissed it by not reviewing it at all. If you were to go back and tell a 1990s critic that EarthBound would eventually become an unassailable classic, I'm not so sure many would believe you. The person who would have scoffed the hardest would have been Jeff Lundgren of Game Players, who concluded that it ain't bad, but it ain't real exciting either. Combat is handled through static display screens that look like they're a throwback to 8-bit Dragon Warrior days. RPG addicts looking for a quick fix, like me for instance, could do worse. But without a doubt, the younger you are, the more you're gonna like it. GamePro was also underwhelmed by the game, though disagreed that EarthBound was just for kids. Actually, they weren't sure who EarthBound was for. EarthBound can be amusing if you know where to look for the funny parts. Otherwise, the humor is too mature for little kids, and the gameplay is too immature for older gamers. Now, turning slightly more positive, Nintendo Power gave the game a 4 out of 5 and liked the great story, fun graphics, good sound effects, and the Identa-Smell Scratch and Sniff card that came with the physical cartridge. They did not like the frequent, sometimes tedious battles and poorly designed inventory system. Superplay also liked it, calling it an all-American RPG that could only have been written by the Japanese. An RPG that's very much more than the sum of its parts. There's nothing like it on the Super NES. However, it was diehard game fans Kay Lee who ended up being EarthBound's biggest cheerleader. They concluded that this game justifies the old adage, don't judge a book by its cover. At first glance, EarthBound seems like an RPG for children with its dinky play school-like graphics and youthful main hero. In reality, this game has one of the most coherent, sophisticated, and funny storylines of any RPG. EarthBound is downright hilarious. What's even better is the further you venture into the game, the more you get addicted to it. While that excitement certainly echoes a lot of today's sentiment, it's clear that EarthBound wasn't seen as an all-time classic back when it first came out. EarthBound isn't the only controversial adventure game coming to the Nintendo Switch Online service this month, because The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask is the big new entry for expansion pack subscribers. Released only 2 years after everybody called Ocarina of Time the greatest game of all time, I think it's fair to say that this follow-up had a lot to live up to. So, when Nintendo decided to go in a darker direction and make radical changes to the core structure, it's easy to understand why not every fan was on board. To this day, fans of the series argue whether Majora's Mask is a great Zelda game or a major disappointment. When it came to the critics, the consensus was a lot clearer. Edge gave it a 9 out of 10, It got a 96% from N64 Magazine. Nintendo Power went as high as a 9.4 out of 10, and every single critic at Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it a perfect 10. Mark notes that while the wow factor of a 3D Zelda game may be gone, the thrill of exploration is still there, and controls and actual gameplay are stronger than ever. Everything else is done right. The memorable characters, old and new, the funny subplots, the added emphasis on time, the bosses, the mini-games, incredible. Greg concluded that this sequel was kinda like Zelda meets Groundhog Day. Besides the novel approach, what you really get in Majora's Mask is more of the same great gameplay from the last game. He also complained that the fuzzy graphics really hurt the game, but not enough to mess with the score though. While EGM gave the game perfect marks, other critics weren't ready to go that high. GamePro, for example, gave the game a 4.5 out of 5 and concluded that it was worth the wait. While the storyline could have been more enthralling, Majora's Mask is still an epic journey combining top-notch graphics, sound, and control with a unique style of gameplay. Next Generation, on the other hand, was noticeably let down by this update. After naming Ocarina of Time the best game ever made, the best they could scrounge up for Majora's Mask was a 4 out of 5. Their issue? Yeah, it's the clock. There's so much to see, but Nintendo will have players racing to see it. The greatest enemy here is not the fiendish Skull Kid, but rather the ticking clock. And each passing moment, it seems, is to be savored more than the previous one. Of course, they also compared the game to a rawhide birthday cake, so make of that what you will. No matter if you feel like it's a franchise highlight or a disappointing follow-up to Ocarina of Time, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask remains an epic adventure game that deserves to be played. Hey, thanks for watching me talk about classic game reviews. Now before you ask, there was no way to cover EarthBound Beginnings because the game was only brought to the US just a few years ago. We didn't see it back in the day, so there are no English reviews from the 1990s. Sorry about that. Now, here's the question I have for you. What should Nintendo do to preserve their games? With the Virtual Console and eShop going away, a lot of amazing games are about to disappear in a blink of an eye. What should Nintendo do to keep these games available? Let me see your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back next week with just so many reviews. I'm talking about Martha is Dead, Shipwreck Escape, Ocean Hearts, Race Condition, Cards of the Dead, and so much more. Trust me, I'm forgetting at least 15 games I need to review. If that sounds good to you, then please do me a favor and click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,